I'm Netty taper shoemaker. Was born in 1938 in the Jewish hospital in Amsterdam. At the beginning of the war, we were living in Amsterdam in the Jewish area called Gloriansstraat. Soon after, my father had to go into the army, and that was well out of Amsterdam. The war really came to a head, and after a year or so, when we found out that they were rounding up the Jews to be killed, my father had a choice. He was told that because he was not Jewish, he was married to a Jewish woman, he was asked to either divorce his wife or he was not allowed to work anymore. Of course, he loved my mum too much, so he had to leave work. But my father then got himself very busy with the underground resistance movement, and through that we started to get quite a few Jewish people coming to stay at our home, who then had to be moved to other places around the country. But after a few years, it was getting so bad that the neighbors started to talk, because we had all these people coming in and out of our house. A cousin from my father's side was arrested with a suitcase full of false passports and coupons for food that was going to be distributed among the Jewish people. When we heard that he had been caught, we just upped and left. The resistance movement helped us to go to a place called Haarlem. We all lived in this 2-bedroom house, and it was just getting far too much for my mother. We always had to be quiet and not allowed to make a noise. And we were, of course, still very young, so it makes very hard. And now we had another baby. My mother kept pestering my father that she wanted to go for a small walk, just get out of the house and get some fresh air. And my father refused. But in the end, he gave in. And that was the 31st of May, 1944. Well, we weren't even 5 minutes away from the house when this big soldier who walked up to us, because they had been looking for my father all these years. And of course, we were arrested right there and then. We were taken to the local police station, where my parents were asked questions and that. And then the lady from the Red Cross came and wheeled the pram out with my baby sister in it. My father and my brother were taken away, and then my mother and I went after that, and we all went to the same prison in Haarlem first. And while we were there, I cannot much remember from that. It must have been traumatic, because it seems to have blocked out. The only thing I know, that at the end of June we were taken out of there, and all the children had to go to one side, and I saw all the women going into these trucks from the soldiers there, and I remember waving goodbye to my mum, thinking that I would see her later again. After 2 days there, there was a lady that came and picked Alex and me up, and we went to Amsterdam, and to my grandmother's place from my father's side. And this lady who came to pick us up was the youngest sister of my grandmother that I hadn't met, and she lived in The Hague. First it was all right being there, but after a very short time the bombing was so bad. Also then, when winter came, the Germans closed off the whole town, and none of the farmers could get in with their produce to sell, and there was only food left in the town, and that was soon gone. So my auntie started to go to the schools where the Germans were. She would then steal the potato peels from what they threw out from their food, and she would bring that home. So that was, then we had this one meal a day of potato peels, nothing for breakfast and nothing for tea. And then we had this dreadful, dreadful winter. It was the worst winter ever. The soldiers came more and more. They knocked on the door every couple of weeks, because a lot of young men who were supposed to go to Germany to work for the Germans and would go into hiding and in false cupboards or under the ground or up on ceilings and that. So the Germans started to inspect the houses to see if there were any young men in hiding. And in the block of flats where we were, if they found anyone, we would all be told to come out of the house and go to the city square, and we had to watch these young men being shot. And by then I was 6 years old, and I was very traumatic because, you don't forget that sort of thing. You know what is going on, and it's terrible. About March, April, May, close to May, that we started to hear all these planes coming over, and they were from the Canadians, the Americans, and English. And then after the second day, when they came over, they started to drop all these parcels. That was for quite a lot of months. So that would have been about 4 months that we hadn't had anything proper food. It was the first slice of bread, and we never forget that, because it was a stale bread, nothing on it, but it tasted so good. It was really wonderful. After a week at school, the children came up to me and they said, "We are not allowed to play with you." And I could not understand why. And then they soon were saying, "Oh, you're a Jew, we're not allowed to play with dirty Jews." I was a very lonely child, because all I had was the dog at home. Of course, I was talking to the dog, but the dog doesn't answer back. And so that was a very traumatic time for me, and I think that also then halted my learning ability as well, because you just can't cope with unbeknown, because that is just in you, and as a child you just, shut off. I was about at school for a couple of months when all of a sudden we were at home at the weekend, that there was somebody ring the doorbell. And my auntie let this man in, and he looked terrible. This man was also skinny, and he looked dreadful. And my auntie cooked him a meal, and my uncle gave him some clothes, and I was just standing there staring at this man. And then my auntie turned around and she said, "Can't you say hello to your dad?" And I didn't recognize my own father. And he was shocked to see me the way I was, and so he only stayed that day, and then he went back to Amsterdam and stayed with his mother, because he wanted to wait for the return of my mother. And of course she didn't come back, and he was just searching among the Jewish people who came back and asking, "Have you seen Margaretha? Have you seen Navesh?" And there was a couple of young men who remembered my mother, because they were together in the same camp. And they were able to tell my father that after Auschwitz, where they had gone to, my grandmother was straight away guest because she was too old to work. And my mother and my auntie, they were sent to different camps. But the minute they arrived there, my mother was so weak for 3 days with no food or water or anything on this cattle train that when she got off, she collapsed and died right there and then. So there is no grave of my mother. They just threw them in ditches, whatever. But in the meantime, the Dutch government had sent to all those people who'd been in the army before a notice to say they had to report for duty to go and fight. And my father, of course, didn't want to. He was just too much traumatized, and he was so weak still. He was told that the only way he could get out of there was if he had his children, if he was married and had his children together. They wouldn't send married men. My father turned around and then he asked what was his secretary before the war, who was still a single lady, never got married, if she marry him so that he could have his children and have back. And so she said yes. I had all of a sudden this new mother, and she didn't want us. Not that I knew at the time, but I found that out later that she'd gone to my aunties to find out if they would have me and my brother. We would be regularly sent out the house. She would cook our meal and put on a plate, and then we were sent to the next farm because she didn't want us around, just my brother and me. And we, could be in winter time and it was so cold, and we still had to walk with our plate to the next farm to have our meal and being looked after by the farmer's wife. We were still very young. We were 10 and 11 years old when my stepmother decided that come Sunday, she wanted to have that day off by herself with my father, and we were not allowed to be around. So she told us then one summer that on a Sunday, on Sundays, I want you to go out for a walk. I want you to be out of the house by 10 o'clock and don't come back until 5 o'clock. So Alex and I became street kids every Sunday. We would go on the ferry back and forth everywhere, and Alex was always a dreamer. He said he wanted to be a sea captain, and he said, you can come on my boat as a nurse. But we were free. Although we had to be out of the house, the worst times were the winter times when it was snowing and cold and rain. When I had my own children, and when they got to that age, you think, how can you send children 11 and 12, out on the streets all that every day? And it's just, it's not right. By the time I settled down, I started to think and thought, well, what am I going to do with my life? I still wanted to be a nurse. And then I started to think, well, I'm a Jewish person. Probably I can get help if I go to the synagogue. But when I came to the synagogue was closed. And then I started to ask about, who was taking care of that. And they said, oh, no, nobody's taking care of the synagogue because all the Jews were killed and nobody came back again. And then I thought, well, I need to find God. Where is God? I thought if he's not in the synagogues, he might have gone to the churches. So I started to go to the churches in the town who had steeples, you can see them. And I thought, well, I'll go to them. And I went to some of the churches, and everybody was like going to a funeral. They had long faces. I couldn't think that God would be so bad that people had to mourn. So I gave up. But the thing is, when you have started looking for God, He's not going to let you go. And so I had this girl next to me in the room next to me at the nurse's home. She said, well, would you like to come with me to church? And I said, oh, what church is that? And she said, oh, it's a Baptist church. So very reluctantly I went with her, and the youth group there were so many young people, and people were happy. They were singing even when they left the church. They were still singing while they're walking out. And the young people came up and they said, oh, they wanted to introduce themselves and, and would I like to come to the meeting after and sing carols. And so I often went with the youth group, and everybody was so lovely. And they really brought me in and made me feel at home with them. But through the youth group, I met Peter, my husband-to-be, and then, but he wanted to come to Australia, and I first didn't know where Australia was, and we only knew each other 2 years, and we married, and months later we came to Australia, so I was only 1 month married as a young bride. By the end of 1962, we moved to Kerrang. After a few months, about 3 or 4 months later, they had a mission there. And they had a special missionary coming out. He was so plain in explaining the gospel and why Jesus came to this earth to die for our sin. That was the first time I ever heard why Jesus, who Jesus was and why Jesus came. I just changed. I had all of a sudden found that I didn't have to carry any more of these burdens that I've been carrying around, and that Jesus had come to set me free. And so I spoke to the pastor, and so he asked me a bit, about my life, and I told him that I was Jewish and that I'd lost my family in the war and that. And he said, well, my dear, he said, now you have become a Christian, you're not a Jew anymore. And I was so shocked, because why wouldn't I be a Jew? I was born a Jew, and why did my mum and my grandparents and aunts and uncles die? Because what are we? And I was just so upset that I decided there and then I would never talk to anybody, tell them at all. So I was going happily to church, but nobody knew. And I wouldn't tell anybody that I was a Jew, neither my children. When we came to Melbourne, by then I had 4 children. And Margaret, my eldest one, she was about 13, and she started asking why I never talked about my grandparents and my mum and dad and family. And so I told her, I said, Margaret, we are Jews, and we lost all our family in the war, including your grandmother. And I said, and you're not allowed to talk about it in case we get a bomb in the letterbox. Then when she grew up and was married, and she all of a sudden rang me, and she said, Mum, she said, a meeting I went to from, it's called a Messianic meeting. And I said, what is that all about? And I'm very impressed. She said, Mum, I want you to come. And I went there, and it was from Celebrate Messiah. And when I saw these Jewish people there singing and happy and clapping, and really I was just stunned, because I had never met another Jew that was happy. The ones in Holland, they were all so sad because, well, we all had lost family, and we'd gone through the trauma of the war, and they were singing a song, and all of a sudden I just cried and cried, because that was the song my mother had taught me and I didn't know, and it was Shalom Aleichem, and I only knew the 2 words, and I knew the tune, but I never knew any other words, and I remembered that was the song my own mother had taught me, and I just couldn't believe it. Coming to Beit HaMashiach was amazing for me, not just to feel at home. When I went to the churches, I always felt I had to leave my Jewishness at the doorstep, being able to worship our Lord. And I've learned so much from the Old Testament. I never read the Old Testament because we were not encouraged in it was always the New Testament in the church. And learning so much, I have grown so much in the Lord. It's just been an amazing journey. I just feel so blessed, and I'm so thankful that the Lord has directed my path to be part of this congregation, to believe, to know that God had done so much for me, and that He set me free from all the worries and all the problems I've been through, and from all the agony and losing family, not being brought up in a loving home. I think I probably would have gone off the rails if I hadn't found God, and I'm very thankful for Him and blessed Him.